All right, welcome again. We'll get started now. This session is being recorded, so if anybody's joining late or if you'd like to refer to it at a later time, we will post it on our website, and you can watch it there and kind of stop and rewind as you please. So we will do that. Everybody is muted throughout the session just to avoid some background noises. If you do have questions right during the session, we welcome you to enter them in the Q&A panel on your WebEx homepage. That way, the session will not be interrupted. And welcome to Tips and Tricks. Today, we're going to talk about some underrated tools in Alteryx. My name is Henriette Haig. I'm a customer support engineer with Alteryx. I've been with the company for about a year now. My one-year anniversary is actually next week. And before that, I was an Alteryx user for over 5 years as a business analyst. So the agenda for today's training is I'm going to just show you some quick upcoming trainings that you're welcome to join. We'll go over the tools and the workflow background in PowerPoint, and then we'll switch over to the designer to look at the tools in the designer and to build a simple workflow. And then we'll just go over some support resources that we have. So these are our upcoming trainings for the next month. For next year. In January, we'll have a parsing dates and times training, a data blending for beginners, prescriptive optimization, and then some in-database tools at the end of January. And you can always visit alteryx.com/virtual training for any past and upcoming trainings. You can register there like you did for this one, and you can watch the past recordings there. And before you get started with the training, I'd just like to point you to our community if you haven't been there yet. We're extremely passionate here at Alteryx about empowering the analysts to deliver deep insights and to do that in hours and not weeks and with very intuitive workflows. And so with that in mind, we've designed the Alteryx community to be a place to connect with other data blending and advanced analytics experts so you can discover some new solutions to complex challenges and contribute some fresh ideas and gain valuable perspective in the industry. So if you want to join us, you can do so at community.alteryx.com, and you'll just register and sign up, and then you can ask questions, you can answer questions, you can submit some ideas to help us improve our product. Our product development team always looks at the ideas that you submit to see which ones are feasible and which ones are really popular by the community. And as you're doing so, you can collect those cool badges like you can see on the right-hand side there. So to give you some background on today's training, what happens is, you get used to using certain tools and you kind of get stuck in a rut and you're always doing something the same way over and over again, and you don't always realize that there might be a new tool that we've developed or just one that you haven't come across yet that will actually help you to do your development much faster and more efficiently. So those are some of the tools that we're going to go over today. And what we have here today is we're going to build that simple workflow over there. And we're going to cover, amongst other tools, we're going to cover the ones that you see at the bottom here, which is the multi-field formula and the multi-road formula. Those are two of my favorite tools, especially the multi-field one. And then the dynamic input and dynamic select and dynamic rename. That dynamic tool group is a very cool one because it's dynamic. And then there's the data cleanse tool is a new one that we've released recently. And that's one that can really help you speed up your workflows too. So we'll start by going over these tools in the PowerPoint presentation, and I will show you some screenshots of the tools and some visualizations of how you would use the tools, and then later we'll switch over into the designer and you can actually see them in action in a workflow. We'll start with the dynamic rename tool. That one is especially useful if you're not sure what the field names are that are coming in for whatever reason, because your input field headers are changing or something like that. And with that option to select dynamic or unknown fields, you can rename fields on the fly that you didn't even know were there. So you have two different modes for this one, the formula Actually, that's not quite right. You have multiple modes for this one. You have a formula mode where you can do a formula where you could, for example, say just replace a certain character with another character if you have underscores in your field name. Or if you have spaces in there and you have a database that doesn't allow spaces, you can take those out. You can add a prefix or a suffix, or you can remove a prefix or a suffix. So that one is great if you're merging two data sets and you want to flag the two data sets so you can tell the columns apart and you can see which field came from which data set. And that way you don't have to rename them all one by one. And then the other way of doing this is where you can take a field name from the write input that this tool has. This tool has an optional write input, and it will allow you to feed in a layout. And you can either take the fields from the field descriptions from the write input, or you can do it from the rows. And so that would be a great example if somebody gives you a file and they give you the field headers on a separate tab in an Excel sheet or in a separate file or something like that. The dynamic select, very similarly to the dynamic rename tool, is great if you're not quite sure which fields you're going to have coming in. And this one has two modes. So you can either select your fields by a field type, where you can say, I'm going to keep all text fields or all date fields or all numeric fields. Or you can do it with a formula where you could, for example, say, I'm going to keep all fields where the field header contains the word address. Let's say if your address is split into multiple fields and you want to keep just those, so then you can then work with those. Now, the multi-field formula, we're going to go over a little visualization before I show you a screenshot of that. This one is, it allows you to work with multiple fields at a time, like the header says. So in the example that you see here on the screen, we have two columns. We have the cost and the revenue. And what we want to do is we want to replace all nulls in that column with 0 so that we can do some calculations on that without the nulls causing any problems, for example. And the formula you would usually use would be if is null cost, then 0, else cost. And if, and then you would do the same thing for your revenue column. You would say if is null revenue, then 0, else revenue, and if. Well, for two fields, that's not so bad. But what if you have 50 numeric fields where you want to do this? Or what if you're like me and you just don't feel like typing things out multiple times? Well, that's where the multi-field formula is great, because it has this variable called current field, which applies to all of the fields that you want it to apply to. So in this case, we're going to apply it to both cost and revenue. And we're just going to say if is null current field, then 0, else current field. So in this case, it's going to look at cost, and it's going to replace the null in the cost column with a 0. And then it will also look at revenue, and it will do the same thing. Now in this row right here, because there's no nulls in there, it will leave the current field as is. And then in this row, because there's only one null, it will replace only that null with a 0 and leave the revenue as is. And this is what the tool actually looks like. It's similar to the regular formula tool, but it has a couple of other options. So at the very top, it asks you if you want to work with numeric fields or if you want to work with text fields. And in this example, we're working with numeric fields. And then underneath that, you have a selection of the fields. And you can select, you can either work with all the fields that you have, or you can work with just 2 of them, or just a few of them, or whichever ones you want to work with. And then the next option, the copy output fields option, that one is checked by default, which kind of throws me off sometimes because I forget that it's checked, and then I wonder why my multi-field formula isn't quite working the way I'm expecting it to work. What that option does is, it's what it says. It copies the field and it creates a new field. And it adds a prefix or a suffix that you can define. Sometimes that's great if you want to compare, if you want to double check your work, If you want to keep both versions of the field, for all of those things, it's really great, but sometimes it can trip you up because you will look at your field and wonder why nothing was changed. The next option is a really cool one that the multi-field formula has, and that's you can change your field type. So in the regular formula tool, if you want to take, let's say your revenue column is coming in as a text field and you want to change it to a numeric field, you have to create a new revenue column and you have to change it to a number, and then you have to deselect the old revenue column and all these things. In this tool, you can actually change the field type on the fly, which is very cool. And then under the variables, you see that they're a little different. There's the constants like you see in the regular formula tool. There's the original fields, which that's your fields that are in your data that are coming in. And then there's that option, the current field. And that's that variable I was talking about earlier that always applies to whichever fields you've selected above. So in this case, we have 6 fields selected here. So that the current field variable will actually apply to all 6 of those fields. And what it will do is, if any one of those pay or benefit fields is null, it will make them 0. And if they're not null, it will leave them as is. So rather than having to type this out 6 times, we only did it once. Now the multi-row formula, again, we're going to visualize that one first a little bit just to make it a little easier to think of how this tool actually works. Because what that tool does is it works with more than one row at a time. And the way it does it is we're going to walk through an example here where we're going to create a store rank. And the store rank is supposed to be by revenue, sales, descending by month. So the first thing we want to do is we want to sort so that our sales are descending, and we're going to group it into months. So we have 3 stores for November, and we're going to have 2 stores for December. And now we want to apply the rank. The store A in November with sales of 600, we want a rank of 1. Then store C is going to be 2, and store B is going to be 3. And then in December, store B is going to be 1, and store A is going to be 2. So we're just going to start counting over and over again for each month. And the way the multi-row formula tool works in this case is that we always have an active row. That's the row the program is on currently. And you have to, it's quite literally like that, where it's on this row, and that's the row it's working with. Then we have a row -1, that's the previous row. And we have a row +1, that's the following row. So in this case, row -1, the previous row, doesn't actually exist. So Alteryx just pretends that the value in the previous row is 0, because it has to pretend that something is there. So the formula we're going to apply here is we're just going to say we're going to take the previous row +1, and that's how we're going to create the rank. And the way it works for the first row is because the row -1 doesn't technically exist, Alteryx is going to pretend it has the value 0. It's going to do 0 + 1, which equals 1, and it's going to fill that in. Then it moves on to the next row, where it's going to do 1 + 1 equals 2. So row -1, the store rank is 1. We're going to increment by 1, and that equals 2. And then we're going to do that again for this store, and we're going to fill in 3. Now for December, because we're grouping by month, it will start all over again. So it's going to insert this pretend row that doesn't really exist with the value of 0, and it's going to do the exact same thing it did for November. Now, if we weren't grouping, it would just keep counting. It would just make this a 4 and a 5. But because we're grouping by month, it starts all over, and that's how we have our store ranks. Now, the tool itself looks like this. So again, there's a couple additional options to the regular formula tool. You can decide if you're going to update an existing field or if you're going to create a new field. In the example we just looked at, we were creating a new field, the store rank, and then you select the type and the size. You can decide how many rows you want to look at. Now, if you select the number 1 there, saying you want to look at 1 row, you're not looking at 1 row. You're looking actually at 3 rows because you're looking at the current row, -1, and +1. So that number of rows tells you how many rows you want to count back and count forward. If you wanted to select 2 there, you would have a row -2, row -1, a row +0, a row +1, and a row +2. So you could be looking at up to 5 rows in that case. And then right next to that, you can see the values for the rows that don't exist. That's where Alteryx fills in that 0. And then underneath is the group by option, which in our previous example, we were grouping by month. And that basically just tells Alteryx that's where it's going to insert a break and start over. So then underneath it in the variables, I already mentioned that. That's where you see your row -1, row +0, and row +1. That's where you can look at the different fields that you want to work with. And in this example is a little different than the one we just looked at. In this case, it's saying if the field contains the word agencies, then we want to keep the field as is. And if it doesn't contain the word agencies, then we want to use the agency type from the previous row. That's what this one is doing. And you can see the way it shows up is it adds a row -1 : to identify that it's working with the previous row. The field summary tool, that's with our data investigation tool. So this one is a slightly newer one. It used to be with the predictive tools. Now it's with the data investigation tools. It's a nice one because it can help you answer a lot of questions about your data. So what it does is it basically creates a report for you of what your data looks like. It tells you about nulls. It tells you about if you have few unique values in your field, if there are a lot of unique values. It tells you if a field is very sparsely populated and all those things. So if you're getting a new data set that you're working with and you really have no idea what this data looks like, you don't know if it's really messy, if it's really clean, or if you want to say that you're going to work with, you're going to do some sort of statistical analysis on the data, you want to know if the fields are populated or not. It can also happen, it can also be great if, let's say, you're working with your data and you're joining your data set to another data set and your join isn't quite behaving the way you want it to because, let's say, you're expecting all records to join and only half of the records join. The field summary tool can help you look into that if you're kind of stuck on it and say, you know, well, half of the data is blank on your join field. It's not going to join then. So it's really nice to just, if you have a new data set, to just run it through this tool, take a look at it, and just get an idea of what's going on. So now let's jump into the designer and actually play around with some of those tools that we just looked at. I have a data set here. It's called the Populations Excel. And you should have received that data set earlier today. It should have been sent out to you if you want to follow along, if you want to bring it into Alteryx. It's just a very simple Excel file. It has state, county, city, and then just these 3 population columns, female, male, and total population. And it looks very much like Excel sheets look. It has the numbers with the commas in them. It has these blanks right here, where Excel just, you just assume that this is all Baldwin County. We have the city names that are a little messy and all those things. So we want to clean this up a little bit. What we want to do is we want to change these 3 columns, the population columns, back to numbers, because what happens with the commas in there, they get read in as text fields. And then the other thing we want to do is we want to fix the city names, make them look a little nicer. And the same with the county names. We want to take out the underscores and we want to title case this. And then we want to spread filling these null fields right here with the correct values. And then we're also going to fix these field headers by removing the underscores right here too. So first thing you think, oh, well, you know, we can just change this right in the select tool, right? Well, except when you run this, the select tool is going to throw you an error because it stopped converting at the comma and it says it might be invalid. And then if you look at the data, you can see that these numbers are way too low. There's not just 2 people living in this county. This was 2,000 something, and it just cut it off at the comma. So that's not going to work. So what we want to do is we want to remove the commas from these fields. And that's where the data cleansing tool comes in handy. This is a nice new tool, and what you can do right here is you select your fields to clean up, and then you have a bunch of different options down here that you can select. And in our case, what we want to do is we want to remove any kind of punctuation, and we want to title case our fields. However, if we run this through here, this would work better if I selected some fields up here. We'll run this again. There we go. It did a great job with our numeric fields, removing the commas from it, so now we can convert them to numbers. It didn't do such a great job with our city and our county names, because what it did was it did the title casing properly, actually, but when it removed the underscores, it didn't put spaces in there, it just took them out. So we're going to have to do that differently. So we'll put this one off to the side because we'll use it later, but we'll have to do a few other things first so that we can actually use it. And the first thing actually I'm going to do is I'm going to fix some of these headers for these fields right here. And the way we're going to do this in the dynamic rename is with the formula option in the rename mode. And we're going to do, because the other options, you know, we can't take anything from our optional right input because we don't have anything. And we can't add or remove a prefix or a suffix because that's not what our problem is. So we're going to work with the formula. And first of all, we want to title case the field. And then we want to replace the underscores. And the way you do that is actually exactly how you would do it in a formula tool. You do your replace char function for your underscore and be replacing it with a space, and then we're wrapping our title case function around that. And the difference is that we have the current field in here. That's that variable that refers to these field headers up here. And in the dynamic rename tool, it will only look at the field headers. It will not look at the values that are in your field. It only looks at that field header row. And as such, it treats all of the field headers as text because that's what they are. It will never treat a field header as a number. So now if we run this, we can see that this looks a lot better now. We have our little title case and we have spaces here. That looks a lot nicer. So now let's move on to fixing our city names and our county names. And for that, we'll use the multi-field formula. And we will select text and we'll do city and county. And as I was saying earlier, this right here is checked by default, and we want to uncheck it because we don't want to create any new fields right now. So this is something that I tend to forget to do, but it's always good to uncheck this. And the formula that we're going to use here is actually very similar to the one we just used in the dynamic rename tool. We're going to replace the current field, the underscore, with a space. And again, current field is the variable that relates to the fields that I selected up on top here. And in this case, it's actually referring to the data within those columns, not the headers. So now if we run this, this is looking pretty nice. We don't have our underscores anymore. We have our words properly broken out. It's looking pretty good. So now we're ready for the data cleaning tool right here. And we can remove what's left of the punctuation, which at this point is only the commas. We only have the commas left because we removed the rest of the punctuation. And then we're going to title case it. So if I run this through now, oh, I forgot to select these fields because I changed the headers. There we go. That looks better. No more punctuation anywhere in the data. Everything is nice and title cased. The headers are nice and title cased. This is nice and title cased. No underscores, no commas. This is all looking very good. The last thing we want to do is fill in these blanks right here. So for that, we will use the multi-row formula. And we want to update an existing field. In this case, state is the one we want to update. And we only need to look at one row because we only need the previous row. And the way we will do this is we're going to look at our current row, and we're going to say, if the current row is empty, use the previous row, else use the current row. So if you're looking at the first row right here, state is not empty. So it's going to fail the test. It's going to use the current row. And then we'll move on to the row number 2. And it's going to say, if state in the current row is empty, use the previous row. And in this case, it's going to say, yep, the state is empty. So we're going to use the state from the previous row. Then it will move on to row 3. Now, because this goes row by row by row, at this point, row 2 will actually be populated. So you can just kind of copy it down row by row. So the expression we want to use is if is empty, current row state, then use the previous row state, else keep the current row state. And if we run this through, you can see it filled in Alabama nicely all the way to the end. Oh, and here we have some Ohio in here too. And now we'll do the same thing with the county. We'll get another multi-row formula. I'm going to update the county field. I'm going to use the same expression. If is empty, current row county, then we'll use the previous county, else keep the current county. And the nice thing about that is it will actually switch the county name because we had Bibb County in here already. It's going to say, well, this row is not empty, so I'm going to keep whatever is in there, and I'm not going to look at the previous row at all. So now we're ready to change our population numbers into numbers. And we can move our select tool to over here. It's going to forget about these fields. These are missing because they we renamed them to these fields right here. So there's a nice option in here that says forget all missing fields, and it will forget all missing fields, and then we can just select double, change them all to numbers, and run it through here. And now if we wanted to do any calculations on here, like we wanted to say, what's the percentage of male versus female population in Clayton, Alabama, we could do that calculation now because we have numbers now. The other tool that I mentioned briefly earlier was the dynamic input tool. And this is a tool that can sometimes be confusing to people. It's a very powerful tool. It has a lot of different options. And I'm going to show you one of the things that you can do with it, which is reading in multiple sheets from the same Excel file. That's just a very small portion of what it does. And I encourage you to go to the community and to search for the dynamic input tool right here. This is a great article to start with. It's part of our Tool Mastery series. So my team has been working on this Tool Mastery series where we highlight certain tools to help you really focus on just one tool at a time rather than a specific problem. We focus on the tool. And this is a great article right here that Matt wrote to get you started on all the different things that you can do with the dynamic input tool. Because you can do it to edit some SQL queries, you can do it to read in Excel files, it really has a lot of options, and there's a couple other great articles on the community for this dynamic input tool. And I will show you just this one feature that it has. So the challenge with Excel files is that you can't just put them in an input tool and you just hit the little wildcard star button and it lets you read in all the sheets within the file, or you can read in multiple Excel files within a folder or something like that. Excel doesn't really do that. But who wants to bring in all these different input tools just to read in? Let's say you have 10 sheets in your Excel file. You don't want to bring in 10 input tools. That's kind of a pain to do. So the dynamic input tool has a cool workaround for that. And the way it works is that you map a regular input tool to your Excel file, and then that one has a feature where right here, instead of selecting an actual sheet, like any one of my years, I'm going to select list all of my sheet names. And then it outputs not the data, but what it outputs is it outputs the sheet names. Then I can use that as an input to my dynamic input tool. I map this to the Excel file, and then I'm going to tell it read a list of data sources, change just the table name, and that will be the different sheet names. And it's actually going to hit up the Excel file 13 times with 13 different inputs for each one of these sheets. And then when you run this, well, we've already run it a few times, but you can see right here, I click on the messages, you can see that it read in that Excel file with the different sheets. And it gives you the 13 different messages, and it tells you right here, it read in 13 queries. And the other options it has is where you can change an entire file path if you have multiple files that you want to read in. Or if you were reading in from a database, you could click this and you could actually modify a SQL query. So let's say you want to dynamically read in only today's data or something like that. You could use a date time tool, and there's a training coming up about those in January. You could use that to pull today's date and then feed that into your SQL query and then just pull in today's data, something like that. So that's that. And then this one, last but not least, the dynamic select, which lets you do just that, dynamically select fields. So instead of having like the regular select tool where you have to do little check boxes and all that stuff. And then, in here, as we saw earlier, if you have unknown fields because you've changed your fields, it's looking for fields that aren't there anymore and it's not quite sure what to do with those. The dynamic select tool doesn't really care about any of those because it's dynamically selecting. And you have two options. You can do field types where you can say, I'm going to keep only numeric fields, and you could do just numeric. Or if you wanted to say, let's say in our example, we want to keep the numeric fields, but we also want to keep the entity name and the entity ID, well, those are text fields. So the way we would do that is we would switch this to a formula, and we would say contains, this is the field name, and we want it to contain the word entity. Or we want the field type to be numeric. And then if we run this, I already ran this, you can see it kept the two fields that are called entity, and then it's keeping the numeric fields right here. So that's an overview of some of our underrated tools that we have. Let me get back. In here, just to give you a quick overview of our support resources. I just showed you the community with that tool mastery article. There's lots of other great articles on there. There's the option to ask questions. We have some great engine work blogs for more advanced users. And then there's our idea center where you can submit some ideas of what you would like. Those are all excellent resources. We have training resources under product training, and then, of course, our virtual trainings. And then we have technical support. That's my team. You can email us at support@alteryx.com. We have a live chat option. That's strictly for simple question that can be answered over chat. If you at all think that you would like to do a screen share or an in-person meeting or discuss something on the phone, we highly encourage you to email support, because then we can schedule a meeting with you and really dedicate the time that your question needs. After this call, once you leave this, we'll redirect you to a survey, and we'd love for you to give us some feedback on what you thought about this. There will also be a question there about what other trainings you would like to see. We'd always love to hear that, because we want to give you the trainings that you actually want to see. Thank you very much.